Good evening and welcome to the Lotus Flower Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Pamela Robinson. And tonight we're going to have a discussion, and it is a very thought provoking discussion as we enter into season number 4, episode number 72. Well, the presentation tonight title is God's Sovereignty and Providence, how he works through imperfect situations. Tonight, we will delve into a powerful hidden narrative within the Bible, and it's in the book of Esther, an epic story of a young Jewish girl who was thrust into the role, intriguing, and political crisis of that time. Emphasis that while God's name is never mentioned in Esther, his presence and influence are greatly felt, realizing that his sovereignty and his providence are in effect in every situation that goes on in this particular chapter. Well, before we go into the discussion, I want to give you some context of this book. I remember how I was a young girl and I heard the story of Esther from the Bible. And this biblical account is of an orphan who grew up to be a courageous queen, saving Israel from annihilation. The girl who is taken to the palace of King Xerxes and rises up to become queen. The one who barely works to save her own people from this cruel plot of the enemy. Yet, there's so much more as we dig into this amazing story. It reveals some of the very powerful truths in its 10 chapters. Great wisdom is found in this chapter as God's mighty hand is working on behalf of his people. Esther was taken from her home and came to live in the palace with many other girls of the harem. She was a Jewish girl, but she never revealed her nationality or her family background as her uncle Mordecai has advised her not to. God gave her great favor among all of the queens. The book of Esther is one of only two in the entire Bible of which is named for women, and the other is the book of Ruth. It's also one of the two books in the entire Bible that doesn't actually mention God's name, and the other one is the Song of Songs. And though we don't read God's name in this story, his sovereignty and loving care are woven throughout the words and the chapters. It's set during a time when the Jews suffered much racial hatred. They had been a minority in Persia for years. And as I learned about the story of Esther from scripture when I was a little girl, my heart longed to be like this woman. I longed to be courageous and faithful, and I longed to surrender my own life to God's plans, even at the tender age of 10. Now, many books in the Bible recount the historical, theological importance of the Jewish orphan who became a Persian queen. While many record Esther's influence among history, my own story was also influenced by Esther, that I cannot help but share this story from my perspective. Now, who was Esther and why was she so important? And why is her story valuable in the book of the Bible? Now, Esther was born at a time when Israel was in captivity, and as a consequence to their disobedience to God, they were in tremendous, and I'm going to repeat that, they were in a tremendous state of being exiled. Now, when Esther's parents were killed, her cousin Mordecai, he adopted her as his daughter. Not only was Esther an orphan woman living in a foreign land, but she was a part of a minority race that was held of low esteem. So much so that later on in life, her uncle Mordecai advised her to keep it a secret, her Jewish nationality. And that was in Esther chapter 2, verse 10. An ordinary day, God chose Esther to do through her what he had planned before she was even born. As a young girl, when I learned of that fact, I remember thinking, oh, if God could do it for Esther at such a young age and use her, then he truly could use me as well. So as we first see in Corinthians chapter 10 and 11, it says, now all things happened to them as an example, but they were written for our instruction. Imagine God penned Esther's story so that you and I could learn, and we could learn from her example. He shows his sovereignty in the lives of these ordinary people. Esther. Esther did not allow her circumstances to make her bitter. Now, I can't imagine a young girl such as Esther who had to endure such a tremendous and a tumultuous time, especially being a Jewish child whose parents had died. But I can only imagine that Esther was obedient to her uncle Mordecai when he brought her with him to the king's palace. While some people have grown up under such painful circumstances, God's goodness in Esther's life and her tender heart led her to do something that was extraordinary for her people. Once again, our topic tonight is God's sovereignty and providence, how he works through imperfect situations. God's name, once again, is never mentioned in Esther. His presence and his influence, however, are felt, and his sovereignty and his providence are throughout this particular passage, all 10 chapters. Now let's look at what it means to be sovereign and what it means for God to have providential rule. The sovereignty of God, it is his absolute rule over creation. Psalms 115 and 3 captures this well. Our God is in heaven and he does whatever pleases him. The providence of God, the unseen ways that God orchestrates events in his purpose and for his good. In Romans 8 and 28, it reminds us, and we know that all things work together for the good of them that love him. These two concepts, providence and sovereignty, are entwined in Esther's story, showing God as the puppet master behind the scenes, moving events toward his divine will. So God is working behind the scene here in this story. And God is working behind the scenes right now in a lot of situations that are going on in our lives and in our nation. The book of Esther stands out as it never explicitly mentions God. The absence underscores the theme of God's hidden presence. Have you ever felt that God was silent in your life at a time where you needed him most? This teaches us in this book that even when God seems silent or absent, he is working behind the scenes. Even when secular powers achieve different purposes that we may not agree with, we have to realize that God, the puppet master, is working behind the scene to bring about good in every situation. The definition of sovereignty is God's rulership over all events, all people, and all situations. Proverbs 21 and 1 says, "The king's heart is in the hand of the Lord, and he directs it like a water course whenever he pleases." God's sovereignty is seen as King Exusius calls for a queen, setting the stage for Esther's rise. Now, even when human leaders believe that they are in control, God is ultimately directing all actions and decisions. God's providence in Esther's story. The definition of providence is God's guidance and preservation of creativity and history. The providence of God shines through Mordecai, guidance of Esther, her beauty that catches the king's eye, and her boldness in approaching the king to save her people. The key scripture is Romans 8 and 28 that says all things work together for the good. Esther's beauty and courage and timing were not mere coincidences, but were a part of God's plan. God often works through everyday circumstances and choices to bring about his will, even when his hand isn't obvious. So, how does God's providence and sovereignty intersect in Esther? Esther's rise as a queen as a result of her circumstance resulted in God's purpose being fulfilled. The king, in his drunken state, he demanded Vashti's dismissal, and the beauty pageant were all divinely orchestrated for Esther to be in the right place at the right time. I'm going to give you a little bit more background of the story. In the story, chapter 1 and 2, when chapter 1 and 2 starts out telling us the history of what was going on here with the Jewish people. This story in Esther is found right dab in the book, between the books of Nehemiah and between the books of Nehemiah and between the book. It's right there by the book of Nehemiah. And when Nehemiah was told by God to go and build the wall, to rebuild the wall, it's right when the Jewish people were seeking exile because they had been disobedient and they were coming back to Israel. But in the story of Esther, many of these Jews, they chose not to return back to Israel. So, in doing so, they were in exile. And this story is right in the middle of what was going on. What was going on is there was a king, and the king's name was Exusius. And the king, Exusius, he had a wife, and her name was Queen Vashti. And Queen Vashti, she was a beautiful queen. The king loved his wife so, and he valued her beauty. However, there was a time in the chapter 1 and 2 that the king decided to have a party. And when having the party, he asked for his beautiful wife, Queen Vashti, to come into the party where he and his men were there partying, and the Bible says they were actually drinking and they were drunk. He wanted his wife to come and he wanted her to show her beauty before all of these men. Now, it doesn't specifically say whether how far he wanted his wife to go, whether he wanted her to disrobe in front of all these men, but it does say that he wanted her to come and parade herself in front of these men. Well, Queen Vashti, she refused. She refused to come and parade herself in front of all of these men. And do you know that back then women were not supposed to disrespect or be disobedient to their husbands? So, in doing so, she did this before all these men. And do you know that that embarrassed her husband, King Exusus? It embarrassed him to the degree that his boys, I'm calling them, came to him and they said, "There's no way," and I'm paraphrasing, "that you should let your wife disrespect you in front of all of these men." And do you know in scripture it says that the other women in the kingdom were going to hear about this great disrespect and they were going to begin to disrespect their husbands. So, in order to make this not happen, King Exusus wrote a decree saying that all the women had to obey and do exactly what their husband said without any without any disobedience. Also, King Exusus, he actually called for his wife to leave the kingdom. Queen Vashti had to leave the kingdom because at that time he was greatly displeased with her. Well, between chapters 1 and chapter 4, roughly 4 years had passed by when these things had taken place. After these things had taken place, after that 4 year span, the king was out fighting wars. And after 4 long years, he began to get lonely and he started missing Queen Vashti and he wanted companionship again. Well, Bible tells us that he sent out a decree seeking all of the beautiful princesses, and I'm sorry, seeking all of the beautiful virgins to come to the palace, and he was going to choose one of them to become his wife. Well, he brought all the beautiful women to the palace that were in the kingdom. And when bringing them into the palace, he brought them there, and it was a full year of preparation, an entire year of preparation that these women came into the kingdom and they were able to be there. They were able to be pampered. They were able to learn how to speak royally. They were beautified and they were prepared a whole year. How many women out there take a whole year to prepare when you're in front of the mirror? I'm sure many of us don't take that long, but I'm sure some of us take an extremely long time getting ready, and to the degree that sometimes we even make our husbands late as we are trying to beautify ourselves. But imagine that these women were being pampered and prepared for an entire year. And after that year, the king called for the women one at a time, these beautiful young virgins that he sought. And the king had these young women come to his quarters and they literally went in to him. And when the Bible means went into him, that means that they went into him with him to actually have relations with him. Now, when they went in with him to have relations with him, these young virgins, the king found favor in Esther. The Bible tells us that the king fell in love with this beautiful young virgin by the name of Esther. So, the Bible tells us in Esther chapter 2, verse 8, that it was so when the king's command and the decree was heard, and when the many young women were gathered together, they brought them to the king's palace. And when they brought them to the king's palace, many of the women went in to the king. However, the king did not choose any of those women. The king found favor in the young woman by the name of Esther. So he readily gave her a beauty allowance, and he gave her beauty preparations, and he also gave her, it says here in in verse 9 of chapter 2, he also gave her 7 choice maidens that were to provide her from the king's palace everything that she needed. Now, the young women that did not please him, they were sent on their way. But Esther was beautiful in form and figure. And the king, when he looked upon her, he fell in love with this queen. He made her his wife, and he fell in love with Esther. Chapter number 2, verse number 10 and 11 tells us that Esther, she concealed her identity. She concealed her Jewish identity. Why? Because her uncle Mordecai advised her to conceal her identity because Jews were not to be accepted into the royal kingdom where she was. So Esther revealed her identity and did not tell the king that she was a Jew. Now, Mordecai, her uncle, worked at the palace, and Mordecai, he was the person that, as he was working at the palace, overheard some of the men plotting to kill King Exusus. And when he overheard these men plotting to kill King Exusus, he told his niece what was going on and about this plot. And he told the queen at that time, Queen Esther, Mordecai told her to go in and tell your husband that there are some men that are plotting to kill you. So Mordecai, when he advised her to do this, she was taking a risk at going in and talking to the king this way. But Mordecai, he pleaded with her to talk with the king. So as Mordecai pleaded with her to talk with that king, she was very clever in how she was going to go about talking to him. So she decided to ask King Exusus if she could have a dinner. And when she had this beautiful dinner, she invited guests. And when she invited guests to the table, her very nature was so sweet and so kind that when she invited the guests to the table, she never mentioned anything about the plot at that time. She never mentioned it. But I'll tell you, it was on the second day that it tells us in chapter 2, verses 21 to 23, that after Mordecai hears what happened, because she came back for a second dinner, and when she came back for that second dinner, she she revealed to her husband, King Xerxes, what was going to occur. And after she talked with him, Mordecai advised her to let the king know what was happening, but at the same time, Queen Esther, after she had informed the king what was going to happen, she did it in such a way that it wasn't totally revealed that her uncle Mordecai had told her this. So what happened further in the story is that King Xerxes had gone to bed that evening, and the Bible tells us that King Xerxes couldn't sleep. And when King Xerxes couldn't sleep, he asked for the men to bring him something to read so that he might be able to get to sleep. So when the men brought him something to read so that he may be able to get to sleep, they brought him a book. And when they brought him the book that he was going to read, imagine this, what happened. In the very book that they brought to him, it mentioned in the book the name of the people that were plotting to kill him, and that was right in the book as he read it. Before he went to sleep, he read about the plot that was happening. And when he found this out, he was very upset. And he sent the next day for these men to actually be hung at the gallows. So the men were hung at the gallows. And when the men were hung at the gallows, Mordecai, a Jew, he was actually exalted into a high position in the king's palace. This all happened because of God's providence and his sovereignty that was working. God was working behind the scene. So I wanted to give you an overview of what was happening in these chapters, and as Queen Esther was being used by God. Now, as I stated, Esther's rise to queen was a result of her circumstances. Yet God had a purpose. The king's drunken state and his wife Vashti's dismissal, and then the royal beauty passion of all these pretty women that were brought before the king, it all orchestrated Esther to be in the right place at the right time. In Genesis 50, verse 20, it resonates with this theme. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Just like Joseph, Esther is positioned to deliver her people by God's unseen hand. God may allow circumstances that seem confusing or even difficult, yet He is working them together for a greater good that we may not see with our natural eyes at this time. Esther trusted in God's providence. Despite her fears, Esther chose to act. Her declaration was, "If I perish, let me perish. If I perish, let me perish." In Esther chapter 4, verse 16. This reflects the deep trust that Esther had in God and in God's hidden hand. This teaches us about stepping forward in faith and trusting that God's invisible hand is guiding us, especially in times of uncertainty. God's invisible hand, it is guiding us, especially when we're going through such uncertain times in our lives, in our jobs, in our homes, at our schools, with our children, with the political system, the political changing of power. God's hand is at work. God's sovereignty and his providence works through imperfect situations. God's sovereignty is his complete rule over everything. God's providence is his skillful weaving of events to bring about his purpose, often hidden right in our view. The book of Esther powerfully illustrates how these two doctrines work together: providence and sovereignty, with God orchestrating Esther's life to fulfill his purpose of deliverance of the Jewish people. Trust in God's sovereignty and providence in your life. He may not always seem visible, and his ways may not always make sense to you, but his plans are always working for your ultimate good. Romans 11 and 6, Romans 11 and 36 tells us, "For from him, through him, and for him were all things made, for his glory and for his purpose to come forth in your particular life." Reflect on times when you couldn't see God's hand in your life, but in hindsight, you realize that he was there all the time. Remember, even in God's silence, that he's never absent. He's always working things together for your good and for his purpose. Remember that God is sovereign and he is in absolute control over everything. Know that the providence of God is his hidden ways of directing events. Know that in Esther's story, God's hand is guiding her to save her people. Know that trusting in God and his purpose in times of uncertainty is a must. That we've got to trust God even when we cannot see his hand. We've got to trust God. Know that if all you see is what you see in front of you, then you're missing the big picture. Know that God's uncertainty is working behind the scenes. Scripture tells us in Psalms 115 and 3, Romans 8 and 28, Genesis 50 and 20, and Romans 11 and 36, that God is sovereign. God is sovereign, and his providential ways are working together in your life despite her fears. Esther chose to act. Her declaration once again was, if I perish, let me perish, because I am trusting in the Lord, and I am going to go and see the King, no matter what is in my way to stop me, to tell me that I cannot go in to see the King, because she did not have permission at that time to go in to see the King, even though he was her husband. She was going against rules, and she was risking her very life. But she was willing to risk her very life for the sake of her people. How many of us are willing to risk our very lives for the sake of our people? How many of you are willing to say, if I perish, let me perish, because I am going to see the King? How many of you are willing to say that I'm going to stand in the gap for my sister? I'm going to stand in the gap for my brother. And I'm going to go outside of my very own comfort zone to make sure that God's purpose is fulfilled in my brother or in my sister's life. We have to realize that even if it seems as though God isn't hearing you, or even if it seems as though there's so many things that are taking place that are evil, that are outside of his will, that are of ill will, we have to realize that God works just like a puppet master, that God works behind the scenes in his providential nature to bring about good. Sometimes the Lord has to allow certain situations to take place, even evil situations, even situations that you and I may not agree with. The Lord has to oftentimes allow these things to take place in order for his sovereignty and his providential nature to work together, that are weaved together. He allows these things to weave together to bring about good. Just like in the book of Esther, we don't find God's name anywhere in that entire book. Even though we don't find his name in the entire book, he's working in the book through his providential ways. He's working through the book. Through his unseen nature, he's orchestrating events for his purpose. God, in the book of Esther, Esther was a Jewish girl. And it tells us right here in the chapter 1 and chapter number 2. It tells us that Esther was a Jewish girl. And when Esther was called into the king's palace, and when Esther was chosen in chapter number 2, when she was chosen to go in and actually sleep with the king, Esther, she wasn't married to the king at that time. Esther was a Jewish girl. Esther actually went outside of what she was actually supposed to do as a Jewish woman. She was not supposed to have sexual relations before marriage. She was not supposed to do that. And a Jewish girl was not supposed to be in the kingdom where she found herself. She was not supposed to be there. Esther, she was not supposed to be chosen as the queen. Esther came from a lowly beginnings and she was a Jew. And God's name wasn't even in the entire story. And we say, well, how could all this take place when God's name wasn't even in the entire story? And I named some things that were taking place that definitely went against the Jewish customs. And how did God allow these things to happen? Well, God did not sign off on these things happening, but in his providential ways and in his sovereignty, he allowed these things to happen. Just like the puppet master, as he was working behind the scene, he allowed these things to happen because they had to take place this way in order to bring about a deliverance for the Jewish people so they all would not be killed. So God had a bigger purpose. God had a bigger purpose. We cannot box God in and only see him in a small way and the way that we think that he's supposed to operate. God can operate in any way he wants to operate. God can use whatever and whoever he wants to use to bring about good and to bring about change. God is able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all that we could ever ask or think, even when his hand is hidden. Like in this story, when God's hand was hidden, God was able to take the king's heart and he was able to turn the king's heart the way that he chose to turn that king's heart. In Proverbs 21 and 1, as I read earlier, it says that God says that the heart of the king is in his hand, and he turneth the heart of that king in the direction that he wants it to go in. So God is able to take whatever rulership, dictatorship, man, woman, whatever leader, he's able to take that heart of that leader and turn it in whatsoever way that he chooses. And he's able to take a situation that his name even isn't co-signed on and use that very situation for his good. Do you know God is yet able to do exceedingly and abundantly above all that we could ever ask or think? You know that the Lord can actually hit a bull's eye with a crooked arrow. He could take a crooked arrow and hit a bull's eye with it. That's just how his providential and sovereignty nature works. So I'm thanking and praising him that he is a puppet master working behind the scenes to bring about deliverance, to bring about the greater good. So, in times like this, we need a savior. In times like this, when we don't understand and we can't figure things out, it is during these times that we've got to trust the Lord. And we got to know that these two concepts tonight that we're talking about, the sovereignty of God, his absolute rule over creation, and the providence of God, the unseen ways that God orchestrates events for his purposes are being intertwined together to bring about good. So tonight, be encouraged and know that God sees all, he knows all. There's nothing that gets past him. There's nothing that gets past the Lord. There's nothing that happens that the Lord does not allow. So even when we feel as though things aren't going right, even when it might even look like things aren't going right, even when our very nature might tell us, no, things aren't right, and no, that isn't the way it's supposed to be, because God did not write it out that way. It says it right here that this is the way that it's supposed to go. But we cannot box God in. Just like Esther, that Jewish woman who became the queen of Persia, she risked her life to save the Jewish people from exile because they were in exile already. However, she risked her life to save them from all being snuffed right out. She did this because Esther trusted the Lord. She trusted the Lord and she stepped outside of all that she knew, and she stepped into her actual purpose. And when her purpose came about, she didn't know how it was going to come about. She had no idea that one day, as a Jewish girl brought up with parents that had passed away and then adopted by her uncle Mordecai, she had no idea that one day she was going to be a Persian queen. Who would have thought a Jewish girl could become a Persian queen? Who would have thought that God would use her and that God would work behind the scenes in such a way? Who would have thought that Esther would have been obedient to her uncle? Who would have thought that Esther, in being obedient to her uncle, would have landed right there in a beauty pageant? Who would have thought? There was racism going on then. There was sexism going on then. There was prejudice going on then against the Jewish people. It dates back all the way back to the 21st century when these things were happening. So who would have thought that this little Jewish girl would have risked her very life for something that God didn't even have his name on throughout that whole book and all the 10 chapters? But God, in his sovereign and providential ways, he moved on that girl. And he caused that girl, which was then a young woman in her 20s, he caused that girl to stand. This is a story of a moral person, a moral person that was obedient, even in the face of danger. She was obedient. That's what I want us to hear and take away from the night. To always be obedient to what the Lord is telling you to do. Even when you don't understand, even when it doesn't look right, even when it doesn't look like it's going to profit you, even when it means that you've got to lay down your life for someone else. The question is, will you take the opportunity that God puts in front of you even when you don't understand, even when you can't see his hand in it, even in a time where God is silent and where you've got to get outside and do something that is totally unheard of, that makes no sense at all. That with your very eye, this very eye gate, we can't even understand what is going on and why am I being compelled to do something that's so obscure. Well, when we look at the story of Esther once again, and we see that God have a special plan and a purpose for this young lady's life, we see how God used Uncle Mordecai, just like Uncle Mordecai was used to speak into the life of his niece. God is using people to speak into your life. God is using mentors to speak into your life. God is using people that may not be packaged the way you think that they should. They meaning they may not look the way you think they look. Okay. They may be from a whole nother background, a whole nother ethnic group. They may believe totally different. They may be from a whole nother political belief system. But God, in his sovereignty and his providential ways, he's using people just like that to speak into your life. And he wants to know, are you going to receive that person? And are you going to listen to what they're telling you to do? And not only are you going to listen, but are you going to act on what that person is telling you to do? Are you going to trust God's sovereignty, his absolute rule over you? Are you going to trust God's providential ways, him working in the background, knowing that he is the puppet master, that he can take one arm and take one leg and up and down, and he can move you any way that he chooses, and he can put people in your path to instruct you that this is the way to go. This is the thing to do. This is how you do it. And give you explicit instruction. Yet and still, when the people are giving you that explicit instruction, it may be to the degree that it pushes you outside of things that you don't understand and things that you've never embraced, and it may even go against the grain. But are you at that time going to say, Lord, if I perish, let me perish, because I am going to see the King. I am going to follow your rulership. I am going to yield to you. And it is in those times that God's sovereignty and his providence is able to work even through imperfect situations. So tonight, I want you to be encouraged and know that God knows all, he sees all, and he's in it all. There's nothing that's too big for the Lord. I'm thankful that the Lord can come in any shape, form, or way that he chooses. I'm thankful that sometimes the Lord allows bad things to occur in order to usher in and bring about good things. I'm thankful that the Lord said in his word that he would never leave nor forsake us. I'm thankful that the Lord promised us that he will always be with us. I'm thankful that the Lord said in his holy wit that greater is he that's within us than anything in this world. I'm so thankful that the Lord is yet in control and he is ruling. He sits high and he looks low. And I'm thankful for his sovereignty and his providence. Once again, I am so thankful that we had an opportunity tonight to talk and to share and to leave you with some nuggets. I want you to go back and I want you to listen to this in the replay, and I want you to ask God specifically what it is that He wanted you to take away from this episode this evening. Thank you all once again for joining me this evening for the Lotus Flower Podcast. We are streaming live on the Dr. Pamela Robinson Facebook page, on the Lotus Flower YouTube channel, and we are also streaming wherever you find your audio podcast. I want you all to know that we will have a guest with us next week, Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And I want you all to be sure to join me again as we stream and as we are here to empower, to encourage, and to walk alongside you as you live your very best lives. Remember that it is the flower that blooms and that blossoms in adversity that is the greatest of them all. That is the lotus flower. Thank you all for joining me this evening. May God richly bless you. Good night.